Antarctica is the coldest, driest, most hostile continent on Earth. Temperatures here have fallen to nearly minus 90 degrees Celsius, that is minus 130 degrees Fahrenheit. Almost nothing lives on the surface. Nearly the entire landmass is buried beneath ice so deep and so ancient that in places it has not moved in millions of years. And somewhere beneath all of that ice, there is a forest. Not the memory of a forest, not scattered fragments, an ancient ecosystem, roots, soil, pollen, preserved in the sediment beneath the ice, waiting in darkness for 90 million years. In 2017, a research team drilling into the seafloor near Antarctica pulled up a core of sediment and found it, the remains of a forest floor, intact enough that the roots were still recognizable, from a time when this continent sat near the South Pole and was still covered in trees when dinosaurs moved through its canopy, when the forest survived 4 months of polar darkness every year and kept growing anyway. The same continent, the same pole, a completely different Earth. What happened between that world and this one? How a living rainforest at the bottom of the planet was slowly buried under kilometers of ice is one of the most extraordinary transformations in the history of this planet. And it did not happen suddenly, it happened slowly, over millions of years. A world dying by degrees, freezing from the edges inward, until everything that had lived here was gone. Tonight we go back to that green world and follow how it was lost. Picture the southern hemisphere of Earth at a time when the map of the world would have been almost unrecognizable. Around 250 million years ago, Antarctica occupied a very different role in the architecture of the planet. It was neither isolated nor encircled by cold seas. It formed part of an immense continental assembly known as Gondwana, a landmass so large that South America, Africa, Australia, India, New Zealand, and Antarctica were joined together as a single geographic body. Across this connected terrain, forests spread without encountering oceans. Rivers crossed regions that are now separated by thousands of kilometers of water. Plants and animals moved through landscapes that modern geography would place on opposite sides of the globe. Antarctica existed at the center of these connections, woven into a continental network that linked climates, ecosystems, and migration routes across much of the southern world. The arrangement did not last forever. Deep within the planet, forces operating far below the surface had already begun reshaping the future. Around 167 million years ago, Gondwana entered a prolonged period of fragmentation. The process unfolded at a pace almost impossible to perceive within a single lifetime. Continents drifted apart by centimeters each year. New ocean basins opened gradually. Coastlines stretched and changed shape across spans of time, measured in millions of years. No single moment marked the breakup. There was no dramatic separation visible from one generation to the next. The transformation continued for roughly 130 million years, steadily reorganizing the southern hemisphere. What had once been a unified continent became a collection of independent landmasses moving toward different climatic destinies. This long separation matters because Antarctica's warmth did not arise from geography alone. The continent participated in a larger planetary system that supplied energy, moisture, and life through its physical links to neighboring lands and surrounding seas. Warm ocean currents could circulate toward its shores. Forest ecosystems could extend across continental boundaries. Animals could travel through connected habitats without encountering major barriers. As long as those pathways remained open, Antarctica remained part of a broader biological world. Its climate reflected more than its latitude. Heat arrived through ocean circulation. Species arrived through migration. Ecological communities developed as pieces of an interconnected whole. By the beginning of the Cretaceous period, many of Gondwana's earlier connections had already been altered, yet two crucial links endured. Along one side, Antarctica remained attached to South America. Along the other, it still shared a connection with Australia. These land bridges carried far greater significance than their appearance on a map might suggest. Through them flowed movement, exchange, and continuity. Plants expanded across regions that would later become oceans. Animals dispersed between continents. Marine currents interacted with coastlines that had not yet been separated by widening seas. The continent still participated in the circulation of warmth that characterized the southern world. For millions of years, those final connections endured. Their presence delayed a transformation that would eventually reshape an entire continent. Antarctica's future rested on them more than any mountain range, forest, or coastline. The story that follows unfolds from the gradual removal of those remaining links, one after the other, until the last connection vanished and the conditions that had sustained a green Antarctica could no longer endure. A cylinder of mud lifted from the floor of the sea does not usually rewrite the history of a continent. Most sediment cores contain fragments, traces, and clues that require careful assembly. This one arrived carrying something far more complete, a piece of an ecosystem that had remained preserved through a span of time so immense that entire mountain ranges had risen and worn away while it waited. The core was recovered by the German research vessel Polarstern from the seabed near Pine Island Glacier in West Antarctica. Its location made the discovery extraordinary from the beginning. The sediments came from a site within roughly 900 kilometers of the geographic South Pole, farther south than any previous evidence of substantial forest growth had ever been identified. At that latitude today, the landscape is defined by ice, wind, and rock. The material brought up from the seafloor described a very different place. Dr. Johann Klages of the Alfred Wegener Institute led the scientific investigation, which was published in the journal Nature in April of 2020. As researchers examined the core layer by layer, they found patterns that could not be explained by a frozen world. Running through the sediment were fossilized root systems, preserved in recognizable arrangements. The roots branched through the soil in ways that reflected living growth, rather than scattered debris transported from elsewhere. Around them lay microscopic pollen from conifer trees, ferns, and flowering shrubs. Mats of fossilized bacteria remained embedded within the layers. Together, these elements formed the biological signature of a dense temperate rainforest, one that had occupied the region for an extended period and left behind the traces of a functioning ecosystem. Among the most intriguing discoveries were tiny fragments of amber. These pieces of fossilized tree resin represented the first amber ever recovered from Antarctica. Resin forms when trees respond to injury, sealing damaged bark and protecting exposed tissue. Its presence suggested forests filled with active biological interactions. Insects likely moved among the vegetation, and some researchers have suggested that periodic wildfires may also have played a role in shaping the environment. The soil itself provided perhaps the strongest evidence of all. It displayed distinct layers and structures that required long periods of stability to develop. Such soils do not form beneath continental ice sheets. They require moisture, vegetation, microbial activity, and time. The researchers concluded that no permanent ice cap existed at the South Pole when this landscape flourished. Conditions had remained favorable for millions of years, allowing the ground to mature and sustain a thriving forest community. Climate reconstructions derived from the sediments painted an even more striking picture. Average annual temperatures were estimated at around 12 to 13 degrees Celsius, or 54 to 55 degrees Fahrenheit. Summer temperatures may have reached 20 to 25 degrees Celsius, or 68 to 77 degrees Fahrenheit. During those warmer months, the air near the pole would have resembled conditions found in parts of modern southern England or northern Italy. Such warmth emerged within a world shaped by extremely high concentrations of atmospheric carbon dioxide. Estimates suggest levels between 1,000 and 1,500 parts per million. Across the globe, tropical sea surface temperatures approached 35 degrees Celsius, or 95 degrees Fahrenheit, while sea levels stood roughly 170 meters higher than today. The forest, the soil, and the amber all belong to that greenhouse Earth, preserved in sediment until a drill reached down and brought their story back into the light. For much of scientific history, the phrase polar dinosaur sounded almost contradictory. Dinosaurs were imagined beneath tropical skies, among broad floodplains and warm forests far from the extremes of the poles. The rocks of Antarctica gradually revealed a different picture, one in which dinosaurs formed part of a thriving southern ecosystem and spent generation after generation at the edge of the world. Evidence recovered from the Antarctic Peninsula shows that these animals were residents, not accidental visitors. Among the fossils are ankylosaurs, armored herbivores built low to the ground, protected by plates of bone embedded within their skin. Roughly the size of a small car, they moved through vegetation that covered landscapes now buried beneath ice. Their bodies suggest animals adapted for stability and defense, feeding among plant communities that flourished during Antarctica's warmer chapters. Other discoveries tell a different story of movement and agility. Fossils from rocks approximately 70 million years old include a member of the Hypsilophodontid group, a lightly built plant eater that traveled on two legs. About the size of a large dog, it likely darted through dense growth, weaving among ferns and shrubs, with a speed that contrasted sharply with the heavier ankylosaurs sharing its environment. Beyond the shoreline, another community occupied the surrounding seas. Fossil remains from Antarctic waters include mosasaurs and plesiosaurs, marine reptiles that ruled coastal ecosystems during the final age of dinosaurs. Some individuals reached lengths of 15 meters. They pursued fish, squid, and other prey through waters that, by modern Antarctic standards, would have felt surprisingly mild. The ocean around the continent formed part of a rich marine world, connected to habitats stretching across the southern hemisphere. Much of this story emerges from Seymour Island, located near the northern tip of the Antarctic Peninsula. Paleontologists regard it as one of the most significant fossil localities on Earth. Layer upon layer of exposed rock preserves organisms from different environments and different periods of Antarctic history. Walking across its geology is a journey through changing worlds, each preserved in sequence within the stone. Among all the questions raised by these discoveries, one remains especially intriguing. During the age of these dinosaurs, Antarctica still experienced extended periods without sunlight. For roughly 4 months each year, the sun disappeared below the horizon. Forests entered a season unlike anything experienced by tropical ecosystems. Temperatures declined, growth slowed, and darkness settled across the landscape. The bones reveal who lived there. They do not fully explain how life adapted to those conditions. Some researchers propose seasonal migrations, with animals traveling great distances toward lower latitudes before returning when light returned. Such journeys would have required extraordinary endurance across connected land masses. Other scientists suggest that at least part of the dinosaur community remained in place throughout the dark season. If that interpretation is correct, these animals may have possessed behavioral patterns or physiological adaptations with no direct equivalent among living reptiles. Their bodies and lifestyles would have been shaped by environmental rhythms, unlike those experienced anywhere on Earth today. The fossil record preserves traces of their presence across millions of years. Through shifting climates and changing landscapes, they continued to inhabit the southern forests with enough success to leave their remains scattered through Antarctic rock. Their world endured across immense spans of time, carrying its inhabitants through countless seasonal cycles before a separate event, arriving from far beyond Earth, altered the course of life across the entire planet. A point of light appeared over the northern hemisphere one day, brighter than any star and moving far too fast to belong to the sky. Within moments, an object roughly 10 to 15 kilometers across struck the region now known as the Yucatan Peninsula. Traveling at approximately 20 kilometers per second, it released an amount of energy comparable to billions of nuclear weapons unleashed almost instantaneously. The collision occurred 66 million years ago, marking the beginning of one of the most profound biological transitions in Earth's history. Rock vaporized, material blasted into the atmosphere, wildfires spread across continents, massive seismic waves radiated through the planet itself. Although Antarctica lay far from the impact site, the disturbance reached its southern landscapes within hours through the Earth's crust. The immediate violence eventually gave way to a longer planetary crisis. Dust, soot, and aerosols filled the atmosphere, reducing the sunlight reaching the surface. Photosynthesis faltered across ecosystems. Food chains that depended on plants and plankton began to unravel. Temperatures declined. Seasons became harsher. Ecological communities that had persisted for millions of years faced conditions they had never encountered before. Across the globe, the toll was immense. The non avian dinosaurs disappeared. Entire groups of marine organisms vanished. Approximately three-quarters of all species were lost. The event drew a boundary through Earth's biological history, separating one world from another. Antarctica endured the catastrophe in its own way. Forest communities suffered disruption. Ecological relationships fractured and reassembled. Many organisms disappeared from the landscape forever. Even so, the continent itself remained habitable. The living foundation of the ecosystem survived. Soil continued to support plant growth, seeds persisted, root systems remained anchored in the ground. Life contracted, reorganized, and began again from what remained. Among the beneficiaries of this transformed world were mammals. During the age of dinosaurs, most mammalian species occupied modest ecological roles. Many were small, active during darkness, and largely confined to the margins of ecosystems dominated by larger reptiles. After the extinction, those limitations eased. Opportunities appeared across forests, river systems, coastlines, and inland habitats. As mammal diversity expanded, Antarctica acquired a role that seems almost impossible to imagine today. The continent became a corridor linking distant regions of the southern hemisphere. Animals moved across landscapes that have since disappeared from the map. Forests stretched across connected territories, allowing migration over enormous distances without the need to cross open oceans. Evidence from fossils and evolutionary relationships indicates that marsupial ancestors traveled from South America through Antarctica and onward into Australia. The descendants of those travelers eventually gave rise to kangaroos, wombats, koalas, and many other distinctive Australian mammals. Their journey passed through ecosystems that no longer exist, and across land routes long since broken apart by geological change. Seen from the perspective of the present, the path feels almost dreamlike. Creatures related to modern Australian marsupials once crossed a continent, now associated with glaciers and polar storms. They moved through forests, rooted in soils that later disappeared beneath layers of accumulating ice. Their footprints vanished, the vegetation changed, and the geography itself transformed. The migration succeeded because a narrow window remained open. Connections still linked the southern continents, and Antarctica still offered passage. Mammals crossed while conditions allowed it, carrying their lineage onward through a world that had survived one great ending and was already drifting toward another transformation. There was a period when Antarctica stood at the threshold between two destinies. The age of dinosaurs had already passed into history. Mammals were spreading through newly available habitats, and the continent still belonged to a warmer Earth. Across much of the Eocene epoch, from roughly 56 million to 34 million years ago, Antarctica remained alive with forests, coastlines, and animal communities that would seem startlingly out of place today. Near the beginning of this epoch came the early Eocene climatic optimum, a stretch of time between approximately 51 and 53 million years ago, when global warmth reached levels unmatched during the following 65 million years. Average planetary temperatures rose more than 10 degrees Celsius or 50 degrees Fahrenheit above pre industrial conditions. Oceans carried heat into regions that today stand far beyond the reach of temperate climates. Along Antarctica's coasts, temperatures reached about 15 degrees Celsius or 59 degrees Fahrenheit. Conditions resembled a cool autumn season in parts of northern Europe. Trees flourished across landscapes that now support only ice and rock. Moisture cycled through thriving ecosystems, feeding forests shaped by species that still retain distant descendants in the southern hemisphere. Among the most prominent trees were members of the genus Nothofagus, commonly known as southern beech. Their relatives continue to grow in Patagonia, New Zealand, and Tasmania. During the Eocene, they formed extensive woodlands across Antarctica, sharing the environment with podocarps, tree ferns, mosses, and a wide variety of understory plants. The continent possessed a botanical identity linked closely to other southern lands, reflecting the lingering connections that still united portions of Gondwana's former territories. The surrounding seas carried their own abundance. Fossil evidence indicates shark diversity comparable to that found in modern temperate oceans. Numerous species occupied ecological niches from coastal waters to deeper marine environments. Early whales had already emerged by this point in Earth's history and were present in the Southern Ocean. Fish communities displayed considerable richness, creating food webs that supported predators, scavengers, and migratory species across a broad marine landscape. On land, movement continued between continents. Fossils recovered from Seymour Island reveal marsupials closely related to forms living in South America. Their presence reflects a southern world where biological exchange remained possible. Animals traveled through connected habitats, carrying lineages across distances that later geological changes would sever. Among the most striking inhabitants were the giant penguins. These birds bore little resemblance to the smaller figures commonly associated with Antarctica today. Some species reached heights of approximately 1.8 meters and weights approaching 115 kilograms. Standing taller than many people, they hunted fish and squid in coastal waters, whose temperatures supported an entirely different marine ecosystem from the one surrounding Antarctica now. Looking across the continent during the early Eocene, there would have been little indication of decline. Forests occupied the land, marine ecosystems flourished, mammals moved between continents. Large penguins patrolled productive shorelines. Antarctica remained integrated into the broader fabric of the southern world. Far below the surface, however, the planet's tectonic architecture continued its gradual rearrangement. Continents drifted, ocean basins widened, and pathways that had long carried warmth across the southern hemisphere edged toward a different configuration. The living communities of the Eocene carried on through their seasons, while those changes accumulated across spans of time far beyond any lifespan. Continents rarely part with a dramatic motion. Their separations unfold through distances so small and years so numerous that entire evolutionary lineages can appear and vanish while the process remains unfinished. Across the boundary between Antarctica and Australia, that separation had been underway for millions of years. Then, between roughly 40 and 35 million years ago, the geometry of the southern world crossed a threshold from which there would be no return. The final connection existed near the region now occupied by Tasmania. For ages, this stretch of land linked eastern Antarctica to Australia, helping maintain patterns of circulation that distributed heat through surrounding seas. As tectonic forces continued reshaping the ocean floor, the connection weakened. Eventually, a seaway opened between the continents, creating what geologists call the Tasmanian Gateway. A map would show only a widening channel of water. The climate system experienced something far more significant. Before the gateway existed, ocean circulation around Antarctica operated within partially enclosed patterns. Surface waters carrying warmth from lower latitudes could still approach Antarctic coastlines. Heat traveled through the ocean and moderated conditions along the continent's margins. As the opening widened, the behavior of the surrounding water began to change. Cold polar water that had accumulated near Antarctica gained a route eastward. Gradually, it started moving around the continent in a developing loop. This circulation remained incomplete compared with the powerful current that exists today, yet it represented the first stage of a transformation unlike anything the Southern Hemisphere had previously experienced. For the first time in Earth's history, a continuous ring of cold water began forming around the pole. Oceanographers often describe currents as rivers within the sea, and this emerging flow functioned as a growing barrier. Warm water still reached Antarctica in some regions, though less effectively than before. The balance that had supported Eocene ecosystems started shifting toward a cooler state. Evidence of that transition appears in sediments recovered from around the Weddell Sea. Tiny grains of fossil pollen reveal changes in plant communities across relatively brief geological intervals. Species associated with warmer conditions became less common. Diversity declined. The composition of forests altered as environmental pressures increased. Plants adapted to milder climates gradually disappeared from Antarctic deposits. In their place, more cold-tolerant varieties of Nothofagus expanded. These southern beech trees possessed traits better suited to shorter growing seasons and increasingly frequent frosts. The forests remained present, though their character was changing. Communities that had once flourished across warmer landscapes now occupied a continent entering a different climatic chapter. Animal movements also felt the consequences. Marsupials and other organisms had long benefited from ecological pathways linking southern continents. Those pathways did not vanish overnight, yet they narrowed. Coastal environments cooled. Habitats became more fragmented. Journeys that had once unfolded across broad corridors grew more constrained with each passing span of geological time. Australia continued drifting northward, carrying its resident fauna with it. The descendants of migrants that had crossed through Antarctica remained on the separating continent and followed their own evolutionary course. Distance increased year after year until reconnection became impossible. The opening of the Tasmanian Gateway did not freeze Antarctica. Forests still stood, animals still moved across the land, and life continued to adapt. Even so, a critical bond had been severed. The southern continent remained connected to South America, yet the first major thread, linking it to a warmer world, had already slipped away. A narrow stretch of land can influence the climate of an entire planet. For millions of years, the Antarctic Peninsula extended toward South America like the final thread connecting Antarctica to the broader warmth of the southern hemisphere. Through that connection, geography continued to shape ocean circulation, biological exchange, and the conditions that allowed forests to persist along the continent's margins. Around 34 million years ago, near the boundary between the Eocene and Oligocene epochs, that thread finally gave way. Between the tip of the Antarctic Peninsula and the southern edge of South America, a marine corridor opened. Today, this body of water is known as the Drake Passage. At first glance, it appears as another feature on a map of the Southern Ocean. In geological history, its opening marked one of the most consequential events ever experienced by Antarctica. Scientists continue to debate the precise age of the passage. Some studies suggest an origin as early as 49 million years ago, while others place its final development much later. The details remain under investigation. The climate record, however, points toward a decisive transition occurring around 34 million years ago. Whatever the exact sequence of tectonic events, the environmental consequences became unmistakable at that time. With both major gateways now open, the Tasmanian Gateway to the east and the Drake Passage to the west, ocean circulation reorganized on a planetary scale. Water could flow continuously around Antarctica without encountering a continental barrier. Winds circling the southern latitudes drove the system forward, establishing the fully developed Antarctic circumpolar current. This current remains the largest on Earth. Every second, it transports roughly 135 million cubic meters of water around the continent. That flow exceeds the combined discharge of all rivers on the planet by more than 100 times. Unlike familiar ocean currents that bend around coastlines or terminate against continents, this one forms an uninterrupted ring around the southern pole. Its importance lies in more than its size. The current acts as a thermal boundary, separating Antarctica from warmer waters farther north. Once established, it restricted the ability of subtropical surface currents to reach Antarctic shores. Heat that had previously traveled south through the oceans encountered a circulating barrier of cold water. The transformation altered Antarctica's relationship with the rest of the world. Earlier climates had been influenced by connections extending across oceans and continents. Following the development of the Antarctic circumpolar current, the continent became increasingly isolated. Warmth generated elsewhere on the planet could no longer arrive as easily through marine pathways. Antarctica occupied the same pole, under the same sun, yet the flow of energy around it had fundamentally changed. Geological records preserve the consequences. Sediments, fossil assemblages, and chemical signatures indicate a shift toward cooler conditions across the region. Ecosystems that had adapted to prolonged warmth found themselves living within a new climatic framework. The change unfolded across spans of time that seem lengthy from a human perspective, though they appear abrupt within the language of geology. By this stage, the architecture of the southern world had entered a new configuration. Australia had drifted away. South America no longer touched Antarctica. A continuous current now circled the continent. Forests still occupied portions of the landscape, and life continued across land and sea. Yet the conditions that had sustained the old Antarctic world were no longer being renewed. The continent had become enclosed within a rotating ring of cold water, and from that moment onward, its future followed a different path. On the scale of Earth's history, 100,000 years can pass almost unnoticed. Mountain ranges remain standing, continents scarcely shift, oceans retain their outlines. Against that backdrop, the transformation that overtook Antarctica ranks among the swiftest climate revolutions ever recorded in the geological archive. Following the establishment of the Antarctic circumpolar current, conditions crossed a critical threshold. Within roughly 100,000 years, a span shorter than the existence of anatomically modern humans, ice expanded from scattered beginnings into continent-scale ice sheets. A landscape that had supported forests for tens of millions of years entered a new state with startling speed. Scientists know this transition occurred through evidence preserved far from Antarctica itself. Deep sea sediment cores, recovered from ocean basins around the world, contain microscopic chemical records of ancient climates. At approximately 33.9 million years ago, near the boundary between the Eocene and Oligocene epochs, those records display a pronounced shift in oxygen isotope ratios. The signal appears across multiple regions of the globe, indicating that enormous volumes of water had been removed from the oceans and stored as land ice. The stage for this transition had been developing for a long time. Atmospheric carbon dioxide concentrations had gradually declined throughout the Eocene. The decrease unfolded across millions of years as Earth's climate system moved away from the warmth that had sustained forests at polar latitudes. Climate models suggest that when carbon dioxide levels fell below roughly 750 parts per million, conditions became favorable for large ice sheets to develop. Ocean circulation supplied the final ingredient. Once Antarctica became encircled by cold currents, temperatures fell far enough for permanent ice accumulation to begin. Snow that survived one summer could persist into the next. Each surviving layer added weight and thickness to the growing ice cover. A powerful feedback process then emerged. Fresh ice reflected far more sunlight than vegetation, soil, or exposed rock. Between 80 and 90% of incoming solar radiation bounced back into space instead of being absorbed at the surface. Areas covered by ice therefore remained cooler than surrounding terrain. Cooler conditions encouraged additional ice formation, which increased reflectivity even further. The first major accumulations likely formed on elevated interior mountains where temperatures were lowest. As those icy regions expanded, they altered local climate patterns. More reflected sunlight meant less absorbed heat. Less absorbed heat encouraged wider glaciation. The cycle reinforced itself repeatedly, operating without any natural mechanism capable of reversing its direction under the prevailing conditions. Across the continent, the transformation unfolded incrementally from season to season. Forests did not vanish through a single catastrophe. They retreated before advancing glaciers. Growing seasons shortened. Winters lengthened. Ice occupied valleys, spread across uplands, and gradually pushed outward toward lower elevations. Each advance altered the landscape available for plants and animals. The same physical principle remains familiar to climate scientists today. Reflective ice cools a region, while darker surfaces absorb more energy and promote warming. During Antarctica's Great Freeze, that feedback amplified cooling. In the modern Arctic, the process is observed from the opposite direction as shrinking sea ice exposes darker ocean water. By the end of this transition, Antarctica had entered a fundamentally different climatic regime. Ice had become a defining feature of the continent, though its spread was not yet complete. Some regions resisted the transformation longer than others, preserving fragments of the older world for far longer than the interior. A continent does not surrender all at once. Ice advances unevenly, climate shifts from place to place, and pockets of survival can persist long after the broader transformation appears complete. Antarctica's descent into cold followed that pattern. The interior changed first, while the margins held on. By this stage, the center of the continent had already become a high frozen plateau. Ice covered immense distances, reflecting sunlight back into space and reinforcing the chill that had been building for millions of years. Along parts of the coastline, however, conditions remained slightly less severe. The ocean moderated temperatures, and the western edge of Antarctica retained a lingering connection to environmental influences arriving from lower latitudes. The Antarctic Peninsula and nearby islands became some of the last refuges for life. These regions projected northward into the Southern Ocean and occupied a position very different from the continent's frozen heart. Their landscapes still supported communities of plants that had once been widespread across Antarctica. Each passing age reduced their range, yet they endured. Evidence for that persistence comes from fossil remains of southern beech trees, members of the genus Nothofagus. Their leaves, wood, and pollen have been recovered from locations astonishingly close to the pole. Some discoveries come from sites only 400 kilometers from the South Pole itself. Geological dating indicates that certain remains may be as young as 2 million to 3 million years old. Those dates create an unexpected overlap in time. Around the same period, early representatives of our own genus were appearing in Africa. Homo habilis lived during these distant chapters of human prehistory. Stone tools were being shaped by hands that belonged to creatures standing at the beginning of a long human journey. At the opposite end of the world, remnants of Antarctic forests still persisted in isolated coastal sanctuaries. The contrast is striking. While early humans moved across African landscapes, Antarctica had not yet fully relinquished its botanical inheritance. Small stands of southern beech may still have occupied sheltered valleys and coastal slopes. Their roots anchored them to soils that carried memories of a much warmer planet. Behind them stretched the growing ice sheet, a white expanse covering the interior. Ahead lay cold seas, whose conditions were becoming less hospitable with every passing interval. One can imagine these final groves occupying narrow strips of survivable ground between two advancing boundaries. Inland ice pressed outward from the continent's center. Cooling oceans reshaped the climate along the coast. The space available for forests became smaller generation after generation. Their disappearance was gradual. No single storm erased them. No singular catastrophe marked their end. Each growing season offered slightly fewer opportunities for recovery. Winters lengthened. Frost lingered later into the year. Conditions that had once supported woodland became increasingly unfavorable. Young trees struggled where older ones had survived. Eventually, the balance tipped beyond recovery. The last Antarctic trees belonged to a world that was fading around them. When they vanished, the landscape continued changing long afterward. Ice expanded across ground that had once supported roots, trunks, leaves, and entire ecosystems. Surface traces disappeared beneath accumulating snow and advancing glaciers. Yet disappearance at the surface did not erase the past. Fragments of that older Antarctica remained preserved within sediments, rocks, and frozen ground, waiting beneath the ice that ultimately replaced the forests. Pressure leaves a signature. It bends metal, reshapes mountains, and over immense spans of time, it can alter the position of an entire continent. Antarctica carries one of the most extreme examples on Earth. The ice resting across its surface has become so massive that the land beneath it no longer sits where it naturally would. Today, the Antarctic ice sheet contains approximately 26.5 million cubic kilometers of ice. The weight is almost beyond imagination, roughly 26.5 million billion tons, pressing downward across the continent. For millions of years, that burden has pushed the underlying bedrock lower and lower, depressing parts of Antarctica by hundreds of meters. Geologists know this downward bending is not permanent. If the ice vanished, the continent would begin a gradual rise. The process is known as isostatic rebound. Land once forced downward by heavy ice slowly lifts after the load is removed. Evidence of the same phenomenon can still be seen in Scandinavia, where the ground continues to recover from the great ice sheets that covered northern Europe during the last ice age. Yet, the weight of Antarctica's ice has done more than reshape the crust. It has also protected an older landscape. Beneath the frozen surface lies a continent that still preserves many of the features it possessed before large-scale glaciation transformed the region. Valleys remain etched into bedrock. River systems retain their courses. Mountain chains continue to rise through the darkness below. Basins formed in another climate survive beneath layers of frozen accumulation. This hidden world remained largely unknown until recent decades. From above, Antarctica appears dominated by white expanses stretching toward every horizon. That appearance conceals extraordinary complexity. The ice does not rest upon a smooth platform. It drapes across ridges, hollows, escarpments, and ancient drainage networks, following contours that originated long before the first continental ice sheets emerged. Scientists have gradually revealed these buried structures through radar surveys, seismic measurements, and satellite observations. One of the most ambitious efforts was the Bed Machine Project, which combined approximately 25 million individual measurements into the most detailed reconstruction yet produced of Antarctica's concealed terrain. The resulting maps transformed understanding of the continent beneath the ice. Those maps revealed landscapes of remarkable scale. Some subglacial canyons extend deeper than the Grand Canyon. Their walls descend through rock that has remained isolated from open air for tens of millions of years. Former river channels can still be traced across the bedrock. Water has not flowed through many of them since the Great Freeze began, yet their shapes remain recognizable. Entire mountain ranges stand hidden from direct human view, covered by ice thick enough to erase every surface hint of their presence. Vast basins occupy other regions, some comparable in size to small countries. What emerges from these discoveries is a portrait of preservation. Antarctica did not lose its earlier geography when the forests disappeared and the glaciers advanced. The landscape endured. Ice sealed it away, shielding it from erosion that might otherwise have erased much of its history. Far below the frozen surface rests a map of a vanished world, still carrying the outlines of rivers, highlands, and valleys formed in climates that no longer exist. Among those buried features stands one structure more striking than all the others, positioned near the continent's heart and woven deeply into the story of Antarctica itself. Some discoveries enter science through a fossil, a bone, or a fragment of rock lifted into daylight. Others arrive as faint signals passing through ice. The existence of one of Antarctica's most extraordinary landscapes became known in exactly that way, not through direct observation, but through echoes traveling through a frozen continent. Near the center of East Antarctica, beneath the thickest part of the ice sheet, lies a mountain range comparable in scale to the European Alps. These are the Gamburtsev subglacial mountains, named after Soviet geophysicist Grigory Gamburtsev, whose seismic surveys first revealed their presence in 1958. Hidden under immense quantities of ice, they rise more than 3,000 meters above sea level at their highest elevations. No person has ever stood on those summits. No camera has recorded their ridgelines. Hundreds of meters of ice cover the peaks themselves, while the total ice thickness in parts of the region reaches approximately 2 and 4 tenths kilometers. The mountains exist in complete isolation from the atmosphere, concealed beneath a frozen cover that has endured for millions of years. For decades, their form remained uncertain. Scientists knew something substantial occupied the heart of East Antarctica, yet the details were obscured. A clearer picture emerged during the Antarctic Gamburtsev Province project of 2008 and 2009. Aircraft equipped with ice-penetrating radar crossed East Antarctica in repeated survey flights, tracing hundreds of thousands of kilometers of measurement lines across the ice sheet. The resulting maps transformed understanding of the buried range. Researchers expected a landscape shaped by immense age, perhaps rounded and subdued after hundreds of millions of years of geological history. The radar data revealed something very different. Sharp peaks rose from the bedrock, steep slopes descended into deep valleys. The terrain possessed the rugged appearance of mountains that had experienced powerful erosion by moving ice. That finding created an intriguing puzzle. The Gamburtsev Mountains are far older than the present Antarctic ice sheet. Given their age, many scientists expected a more subdued landscape. Instead, radar imagery showed dramatic relief, suggesting extensive glacial carving. Valleys cut into the rock resembled features found in mountain regions where glaciers actively reshape the land. Evidence points toward an earlier chapter of Antarctic cooling. Before continental ice engulfed the region, smaller mountain glaciers likely formed on the highest elevations during colder intervals. Those glaciers carved valleys, sharpened ridges, and sculpted the terrain. Later, as the Great Freeze accelerated, expanding ice spread outward and eventually buried the very landscape that had helped create it. Many researchers now regard the Gamburtsev Mountains as the most likely birthplace of the Antarctic ice sheet. Their elevation provided conditions favorable for the earliest large accumulations of snow and ice. When carbon dioxide levels and ocean circulation shifted sufficiently, ice gathered first on these highlands. From there, it expanded across surrounding regions, growing larger with each cycle of accumulation. The idea carries a certain symmetry. A mountain range may have served as the initial foundation of the continental ice that transformed Antarctica. The forests vanished, the climate changed, and the frozen cover spread across the land. In time, the mountains that helped nurture that process became entombed within the ice itself. Today, the Gamburtsev Mountains remain locked in darkness beneath approximately 2 and 4 tenths kilometers of ice, preserved far beyond human sight. Their peaks, valleys, and ridges continue to exist exactly where they formed, concealed beneath the frozen continent that grew from their heights. Beneath them, however, Antarctica still guards even stranger secrets. Far below the winds, glaciers, and ice-covered plains of Antarctica, another landscape exists, one shaped by forces that never stopped working when the continent froze. Deep within the Earth, heat continues its slow journey outward, a process that began roughly 4.5 billion years ago and still persists today. That heat rises through Antarctic bedrock from below. Above it sits an ice sheet, several kilometers thick, pressing downward with extraordinary weight. Under such pressure, Water can remain liquid at temperatures lower than the ordinary freezing point. Where geothermal warmth meets the deepest layers of ice, melting occurs along the boundary between rock and ice, creating a thin but persistent layer of water. This water cannot flow freely to an ocean or river. The continent is sealed beneath its frozen cover. Meltwater, therefore, gathers wherever the buried landscape provides space for it. Depressions in the bedrock fill gradually. Ancient basins collect water. Valleys carved long before the rise of the continental ice sheet become reservoirs once more. Across Antarctica, a network of concealed water bodies has formed within terrain that has not seen open skies for tens of millions of years. Scientific surveys have identified more than 400 subglacial lakes beneath the Antarctic ice sheet. They exist in complete darkness, trapped between stone and ice. Pressures can reach approximately 350 atmospheres. Temperatures hover just below the normal freezing point of water, balanced between geothermal heating from below and immense pressure from above. These conditions sound improbable, yet they have sustained liquid water across large portions of the buried continent. The lakes do not all exist in isolation. Radar studies and satellite observations indicate that many are connected through subglacial rivers and drainage pathways. Water migrates gradually from one basin to another, guided by differences in pressure and the shape of the hidden landscape. The movement is measured not in days or months, but often in centuries. Entire drainage systems operate beneath the ice without a single ray of sunlight reaching them. Among all these concealed waters, one stands apart in scale. Lake Vostok lies beneath Russia's Vostok Station in East Antarctica, approximately 4 kilometers below the surface. The lake stretches roughly 250 kilometers in length, reaches widths approaching 50 kilometers, and extends nearly 1 kilometer from surface to floor. Its upper surface rests approximately 500 meters below sea level. In size, it is comparable to Lake Ontario. Lake Vostok remains liquid at about -3 degrees Celsius or 27 degrees Fahrenheit. Under ordinary conditions, water at that temperature would freeze. The immense weight of the ice above, combined with geothermal energy rising through the bedrock, alters the balance enough to keep the lake unfrozen. It exists in a narrow physical window where pressure and heat work together continuously. Its isolation makes it especially intriguing. Some researchers propose that Lake Vostok has remained separated from Earth's atmosphere since the East Antarctic ice sheet first became established. If that interpretation is correct, portions of its deepest water may have existed apart from the outside world for approximately 34 million years. The lake endures beneath 4 kilometers of ice, enclosed in darkness, and separated from familiar ecosystems by geological spans of time. Within that isolation lies one of Antarctica's most compelling scientific mysteries, the possibility that life found a way to persist even there. A clue emerged not from the water of Lake Vostok itself, but from ice that had once been water. Frozen into the underside of the glacier was a layer known as accretion ice, material formed when liquid from the lake attached itself to the base of the ice sheet and solidified. In effect, it represented the uppermost skin of the buried lake, lifted upward and preserved within the glacier above. Scientists studying this unusual ice began uncovering evidence that transformed ideas about what might exist in the darkness below. In 1999, researchers published findings in the journal Science describing microbial traces recovered from accretion ice associated with Lake Vostok. The discovery suggested that biological activity might persist in an environment isolated from sunlight and sealed beneath kilometers of frozen water. As analytical techniques improved, the picture became more detailed. A study published in 2013 examined genetic material extracted from accretion ice and identified more than 3,500 distinct genetic signatures. These traces appeared to represent bacteria, fungi, and a variety of other organisms. Among the most surprising findings were genetic sequences resembling microorganisms commonly associated with fish intestines. Such evidence remains the subject of careful scientific discussion, yet its implications are striking. Microorganisms linked to digestive systems suggest that, at some point in the history of the lake, organisms possessing internal digestive tracts may have existed within that environment or passed through connected waters. Researchers continue to debate how these signatures arrived there and whether contamination, ancient ecosystems, or still unknown processes provide the most accurate explanation. Whatever the ultimate answer, life in Lake Vostok would face conditions unlike those experienced in most ecosystems on Earth. No sunlight reaches the lake. Photosynthesis cannot operate in perpetual darkness. Organisms surviving there would need another source of energy. One possibility is a metabolic strategy known as chemolithotrophy, in which microbes obtain energy from chemical reactions involving minerals dissolved in water or present within surrounding rock. Entire communities can persist through such reactions without any dependence on sunlight. The physical environment adds further complexity. Pressure within Lake Vostok reaches approximately 350 atmospheres, comparable to conditions roughly 3.5 kilometers beneath the ocean surface. The water is also thought to contain unusually high concentrations of dissolved oxygen. One explanation proposes that gas hydrates trapped within the overlying ice gradually release oxygen as they interact with the lake environment, enriching the water over immense spans of time. Lake Vostok often feels unlike a terrestrial setting at all. For planetary scientists, it serves as one of the closest natural analogs to environments believed to exist elsewhere in the solar system. Beneath the frozen crust of Jupiter's moon Europa and under the icy shell of Saturn's moon Enceladus, evidence points toward hidden oceans separated from sunlight in ways that echo conditions beneath Antarctica. Because of this connection, every effort to investigate Lake Vostok carries importance beyond Earth itself. Techniques designed to reach the lake without introducing contamination mirror the methods future explorers may need when examining extraterrestrial oceans. Each drill core recovered from Antarctica becomes part geology, part biology, and part rehearsal for exploration far beyond our planet. Lake Vostok may be among the most unfamiliar environments known on Earth, yet it is only one member of a much larger hidden network. Hundreds of lakes remain concealed beneath the Antarctic ice sheet, while above them, the ice preserves another record altogether, layer upon layer of planetary memory. Every snowfall in Antarctica leaves behind more than a layer of frozen water. It captures a moment. Snow settles onto older snow, season after season, and the growing weight gradually compresses the lower layers. Fluffy crystals transform into dense glacial ice. During that transformation, tiny pockets of air become trapped and sealed away from the atmosphere above. Those bubbles are extraordinary records. Each one contains a sample of the air that existed when the snow originally fell. Preserved in chronological order, they form a layered archive stretching backward through time. Reading an Antarctic ice core is like turning pages in a history book written by the atmosphere itself. One year stacked upon another across immense spans of time. At sites such as Vostok Station and Dome Concordia in East Antarctica, scientists have drilled deep into the ice sheet and recovered cores containing air that is up to 800,000 years old. Within those cylinders of ice lies an uninterrupted sequence of atmospheric samples extending through 8 complete glacial cycles. Few records on Earth approach that level of continuity. The ice preserves environmental history with a fidelity unmatched by most rocks, sediments, or fossils. The trapped bubbles contain information about carbon dioxide concentrations, methane abundance, volcanic dust, sea salt, and other chemical markers carried through the atmosphere. Layer by layer, they document shifts between colder and warmer climates. Massive volcanic eruptions leave traces. Changes in ocean circulation appear in subtle chemical signals. Entire ice ages unfold through variations measured within microscopic pockets of ancient air. As researchers assembled these records, a striking pattern emerged. Across all 800,000 years, represented in the cores, atmospheric carbon dioxide and global temperature moved together with remarkable consistency. During warmer intervals, carbon dioxide concentrations increased. During colder intervals, they declined. The relationship appeared repeatedly through every major climate oscillation preserved in the ice. Different eras produced different conditions, yet the connection remained visible throughout the entire sequence. The significance of this pattern extends beyond any single warm period or ice age. It reveals a climate system in which atmospheric chemistry and planetary temperature remained closely linked over hundreds of thousands of years. The evidence does not rely on indirect estimates alone. The bubbles contain actual samples of ancient air, preserved since the moment they were trapped within the accumulating snow. Another observation emerged from the record. Across those 800,000 years, carbon dioxide concentrations never exceeded approximately 300 parts per million. Not during the warmest interglacial periods, not during any of the natural climate fluctuations recorded in the cores. Through 8 cycles of advancing and retreating ice, that threshold remained intact. Today, atmospheric carbon dioxide concentrations are approximately 421 parts per million. The ice core record indicates that such values fall outside the range observed during the past 800,000 years. Other geological evidence suggests similar concentrations may not have occurred for several million years before the present. There is a certain symmetry in this discovery. The same Antarctic ice sheet that grew after the continent's transformation now preserves a detailed account of atmospheric conditions that existed before many of its modern features developed. Locked within its layers are measurements from worlds long vanished. The archive continues to accumulate with each passing snowfall. At the same time, the chemical story preserved inside the ice reveals a climate entering conditions absent from anything recorded within those 800,000 years of frozen memory. A fracture can begin where no one can see it. Far from the surface, beneath floating ice and dark seawater, changes measured in fractions of a degree can alter the future of an entire continent. Antarctica, shaped by the growth of ice for tens of millions of years, is now revealing what happens when that process shifts direction. Between 1979 and 2024, the Antarctic ice sheet lost an average of 105 billion tons of ice each year. The pace of loss has increased markedly since the early years of the 21st century. Across such a large continent, however, the changes are uneven. Some regions remain comparatively stable, while others are transforming at a rate that commands the attention of glaciologists across the world. The greatest concern centers on West Antarctica. Unlike much of East Antarctica, large portions of the West Antarctic ice sheet rest on bedrock lying below sea level. This arrangement creates a different relationship between ice and ocean. Air temperatures matter, yet the most important changes are occurring from below, where seawater interacts directly with the underside of floating ice. Along the coast, glaciers spread outward and form broad platforms known as ice shelves. These shelves already float on the ocean, so their melting does not directly raise sea levels. Their importance lies elsewhere. They act as barriers that slow the movement of inland ice. The immense glaciers behind them press toward the coast continuously, and the shelves provide resistance to that flow. When an ice shelf becomes thinner, its grip weakens. The glaciers feeding into it begin moving faster. More ice is transferred from land into the sea. A change that begins beneath a floating platform can therefore affect regions extending far inland across the continent. One of the clearest demonstrations occurred in February of 2002. The Larsen B ice shelf, a floating body of ice roughly the size of the state of Rhode Island, collapsed over just 35 days. Evidence suggests it had existed continuously for at least 10,000 years. Through warm intervals and cool intervals, through the entire span of human civilization, it endured. Then, within little more than a month, much of it disintegrated. The response from nearby glaciers was immediate in geological terms. Freed from the restraint the shelf had provided, several glaciers accelerated dramatically. Measurements showed flow speeds increasing by roughly a factor of 8 within months. Ice that had once moved at a measured pace surged toward the sea. Scientists tracing the cause identified an important source of heat. Around parts of West Antarctica, relatively warm seawater known as circumpolar deep water has been reaching the undersides of ice shelves. Under normal conditions, this water remains largely separated from the continental shelf. Shifts in ocean circulation and wind patterns can alter that arrangement, allowing the warmer water to contact the ice directly. There is a striking symmetry in this process. The Antarctic circumpolar current helped isolate Antarctica from warmer waters and contributed to the conditions that allowed continental ice to flourish. Today, within a changed climate system, related ocean processes are helping deliver heat toward the ice sheet's vulnerable edges. The same oceanic framework that once supported expansion is now participating in retreat. The continent is still overwhelmingly frozen, yet its margins are changing. Along those edges, where ice, ocean, and atmosphere meet, the long story of Antarctic ice continues to be written in a new direction. Maps often reduce glaciers to pale shapes spread across a continent, yet one of those shapes has become the focus of extraordinary attention. Along the coast of West Antarctica lies the Thwaites Glacier, a body of ice roughly the size of Florida, draining a catchment area comparable to Great Britain. Among all the glaciers on Earth, few are observed with greater intensity. Its prominence comes partly from scale. Thwaites alone contains enough ice to raise global sea levels by more than half a meter if it were lost entirely. That figure is substantial, though it captures only part of the concern. Researchers devote so much effort to Thwaites because of the role it plays within a larger system of interconnected ice. The glacier occupies a position that resembles a structural support within the West Antarctic ice sheet. Behind it lies a much greater reservoir of ice extending deep into the continent. Thwaites helps regulate the movement of that ice toward the ocean. Should the glacier weaken beyond certain limits, the consequences would extend far beyond its own boundaries. Current estimates suggest that destabilization of the wider region it restrains could contribute between 2 and 3 meters of additional sea level rise over centuries. Understanding that vulnerability requires looking below the ice itself. The bedrock underlying Thwaites does not rise inland, it descends. As the glacier retreats, seawater gains access to progressively deeper portions of the basin. Each step backward exposes more ice to conditions that favor further retreat. The landscape beneath the glacier creates a geometry that amplifies change instead of resisting it. Glaciologists describe this process as marine ice sheet instability. The phrase sounds technical, yet it refers to a straightforward physical problem. Once retreat begins across a downward sloping bed, the glacier can enter a self-reinforcing cycle. Ice loss exposes deeper grounding zones. Deeper grounding zones permit additional retreat, and the cycle continues. Within that process, scientists sometimes use the word irreversible because the ice sheet itself possesses no internal mechanism capable of restoring the previous state once a critical threshold has been crossed. Measurements gathered during recent years have revealed conditions that make this concern more immediate. In 2023, surveys confirmed that circumpolar deep water was reaching the grounding line of Thwaites. This boundary marks the place where the glacier lifts from the seabed and begins floating. It is one of the most important locations in the Antarctic ice system. The water arriving there is relatively warm by polar standards, more than 2 degrees Celsius or 36 degrees Fahrenheit above the local freezing point. Contact at the glacier's base allows melting to occur, where observation is most difficult. Instruments lowered through the ice have shown rates of basal melting greater than many earlier estimates suggested. Attention has also focused on the floating ice shelf positioned in front of the glacier. Fractures have spread through portions of the shelf, forming complex networks of cracks. Researchers have informally named some of these features, including one widely known as the Doomsday Crack. Studies indicate that parts of the shelf may fragment within years to decades, reducing the resistance that currently slows the glacier's flow toward the sea. Thwaites remains only one glacier within Antarctica's immense ice system. Even so, its future has become a measure of how rapidly change can unfold when ice, ocean, and bedrock begin working together in the same direction. A number can sit on a page for years before its scale becomes clear. 58 meters is one of those numbers. It represents the approximate amount global sea level would rise if the entire Antarctic ice sheet were lost, a transformation equal to about 190 feet of additional ocean spread across the coastlines of the world. Imagining such a change requires setting aside the familiar outlines of modern maps. Shorelines that seem permanent would move far inland. Districts, ports, airports, wetlands, river deltas, and coastal plains would occupy different places relative to the sea. Cities such as London, New York, Shanghai, Mumbai, Tokyo, Sydney, Miami, Amsterdam, Bangkok, and Jakarta were built during an era when sea level remained comparatively stable. Under a rise measured in tens of meters, many of those urban landscapes would exist below the ocean's surface. The source of that potential rise is concentrated in a single continent. Antarctica contains approximately 26.5 million cubic kilometers of ice. Locked within that frozen mass is about 61% of Earth's fresh water. Snow accumulated layer upon layer across immense spans of time, compressed into ice and preserved at the southern end of the planet. Few natural systems hold so much influence over the future shape of coastlines. The figure of 58 meters is not a forecast for the coming century. Even under the most extreme warming scenarios examined by researchers, complete loss of the Antarctic ice sheet would unfold across centuries to millennia. Ice sheets respond on timescales that often exceed human lifetimes. Their size grants them inertia, yet that same size gives them the capacity for enormous long-term consequences. More immediate concerns emerge from much smaller numbers. Around 1 meter of sea level rise by the year 2100 remains within the range of projections under high emissions scenarios. A change of that magnitude would reshape flood risk for hundreds of millions of people. Storm surges would reach farther inland. High tides would cross boundaries that currently contain them. Infrastructure designed around 20th century coastlines would face conditions for which it was never intended. Scientists estimate that each additional centimeter of sea level rise exposes roughly 6 million more people to coastal flooding risk. Such increments may appear modest when viewed individually. Added together across decades, they alter the frequency and severity of flooding events in ways that communities can measure directly. The Antarctic ice sheet cannot be understood as a fixed block of frozen water. It behaves as a dynamic system responding to atmospheric conditions, ocean circulation, snowfall patterns, and carbon dioxide concentrations. Within that system, feedback loops influence how change unfolds. Certain thresholds can produce responses larger than the forces that initiated them. One of those feedbacks helped create the Great Freeze that transformed Antarctica millions of years ago. Bright ice reflected incoming sunlight, reinforcing cooling and encouraging additional ice growth. Today, the same physical principle operates in reverse, where ice retreats. Dark ocean water absorbs more solar energy than reflective ice. Greater absorption promotes warming. Warming encourages further ice loss, and additional dark water becomes exposed. The planet that once supported the growth of continental ice still follows the same laws of physics. Only the direction of change has shifted. Evidence sometimes waits in places no one expects. In layers of seafloor sediment, in fragments of fossil wood, in grains of ancient pollen carried by vanished rivers, the planet preserved a record of a world that once existed at the southern pole. When scientists pieced those clues together, they revealed an unsettling fact. The conditions that supported Antarctic rainforests were not hypothetical. They were real, documented, and written into Earth's own history. During the Cretaceous period, atmospheric carbon dioxide concentrations are estimated to have ranged between roughly 1,000 and 1,500 parts per million. Under those conditions, Antarctica supported forests, freshwater ecosystems, and a landscape almost unrecognizable compared with the continent of today. The southern pole was not capped by an ice sheet. It belonged to a greenhouse world, operating under a very different climatic balance. Global temperatures during that era stood approximately 12 to 14 degrees Celsius, or 54 to 57 degrees Fahrenheit, warmer than pre-industrial averages. Sea levels reached around 170 meters higher than modern coastlines. Water covered continental regions that are now dry land. Across the planet, climate zones occupied different positions, and Antarctica remained part of a living network of ecosystems extending into high southern latitudes. Those figures matter because they provide a direct example of how Earth responds to sustained concentrations of carbon dioxide. The comparison is not perfect. Continents occupied different positions, ocean circulation differed, and the planet evolved under conditions separated from the present by tens of millions of years. Even so, the broad relationship between atmospheric chemistry and climate remains visible across deep time. Today, atmospheric carbon dioxide concentrations exceed 421 parts per million. before large-scale industrial activity. The level stood near 280 parts per million. The longest ice core records recovered from Antarctica indicate that over the previous 800,000 years, natural climate cycles never pushed concentrations beyond roughly 300 parts per million. Modern values already sit well outside that range. Under high emissions scenarios, carbon dioxide concentrations could eventually approach 800 to 1,000 parts per million over the coming centuries. Such values would still remain below many estimates for the Cretaceous world, yet they move in the same direction along the same climatic spectrum. The significance lies less in reaching an exact historical number and more in understanding what elevated carbon dioxide has repeatedly done throughout Earth's past. The response unfolds gradually. Oceans absorb and redistribute heat over immense timescales. Ice sheets react across centuries and millennia. Antarctica will not return to a rainforest within any human lifetime or within the span of any existing civilization. Physical systems of that size possess enormous inertia. Their movement resembles a turning tide more than a sudden shift. Even so, observations from recent decades indicate that parts of the Antarctic ice sheet are changing more rapidly than many earlier models anticipated. The comparison with the Cretaceous period therefore serves a particular purpose. It demonstrates capability. The planet has already shown what sustained greenhouse conditions can produce. Geological archives preserve the soils, roots, fossil forests, and chemical signatures left behind by that experiment. There is something striking about where this evidence was found. The proof spent millions of years stored beneath ocean sediments and layers of rock, undisturbed until drilling projects brought it back to the surface. Long before anyone debated future climates, the record already existed, waiting in the remnants of a rainforest that once stood near the South Pole. Along the shores of Eocene Antarctica, life faced a challenge very different from the one confronting forests on land. As temperatures fell and ocean currents reorganized, the surrounding seas began a transformation that unfolded over millions of years. Water that had once supported a diverse marine community grew colder generation after generation. For many species, movement offered an escape route. Others remained where they were, carried forward into an environment becoming increasingly hostile to their survival. Among those residents were the ancestors of a group now known as the Notothenioids. Early members of this lineage appear to have been fairly ordinary coastal fish, occupying habitats that would not have seemed unusual in the marine ecosystems of their time. Nothing about their appearance suggested they would become one of the most extraordinary examples of evolutionary innovation ever documented among vertebrates. As Antarctic waters approached temperatures capable of freezing the body fluids of most fish, a severe biological problem emerged. Tiny ice crystals forming inside tissues can expand rapidly, damaging cells and disrupting vital functions. In most vertebrates, such conditions lead quickly to death. The cooling Southern Ocean created a selective pressure of unusual intensity, acting across countless generations as the marine environment continued to change. Within the Notothenioid lineage, evolution produced a solution unlike anything previously known. These fish developed specialized antifreeze proteins that circulate through their blood and bodily fluids. The proteins attach themselves to microscopic ice crystals and prevent further crystal growth. Instead of allowing sharp structures to expand and spread through tissues, the molecules interrupt the process at its earliest stages. Internal fluids remain liquid even when surrounding waters reach temperatures that would ordinarily prove fatal. The elegance of this adaptation lies in its precision. No external shelter protects the fish. No behavioral strategy eliminates exposure to cold. Survival depends on biochemical machinery operating continuously within the body. Research indicates that these antifreeze proteins evolved independently within the lineage, arising from genetic changes that transformed existing biological material into an entirely new function. Antarctica's marine environment shaped an evolutionary path found nowhere else on Earth. As millions of years passed, the descendants of those survivors expanded into ecological roles, left vacant by species less suited to the new conditions. Today, notothenioids account for roughly 90% of the fish biomass in the Southern Ocean. Some inhabit coastal habitats near the continent's margins. Others occupy deeper waters, far from shore. Collectively, they form the foundation of many Antarctic food webs, supporting seabirds, seals, and larger predators throughout the region. Their success illustrates a broader pattern visible throughout Earth's history. Environmental upheaval does not produce a single outcome. Many lineages disappear. A few persist by acquiring traits that allow them to function under altered conditions. Evolution works with whatever variation exists, testing countless possibilities until one proves sufficient for survival. The story reaches beyond Antarctica itself. Scientists studying antifreeze proteins have explored their potential use in cryopreservation, the practice of storing biological tissues and organs at very low temperatures. Understanding how these molecules prevent ice damage may help improve techniques used in medicine and transplantation. In that sense, a solution forged within freezing southern seas millions of years ago continues to offer insights today. While forests vanished from the continent and ice spread across the landscape, these fish endured by becoming something their ancestors had never been. Living evidence that life's response to change can be as transformative as the changes themselves. A fossilized leg bone can tell a surprising story. Held in the hand, it appears oversized for a penguin, thick and heavy in a way that seems almost mistaken. Yet the rocks of Seymour Island preserve repeated evidence that some of Antarctica's earliest penguins were creatures of extraordinary scale, residents of a continent and ocean profoundly different from the one known today. During the Eocene, coastal waters around Antarctica supported rich marine ecosystems filled with fish, squid, and other prey. Fossils recovered from Seymour Island include penguin species approaching 1.8 meters in height and weighing as much as 115 kilograms. These birds stood taller than many adults alive today. Their long beaks and elongated bodies gave them a silhouette unlike that of modern penguins, creating an impression closer to a seabird giant than to the compact forms familiar in the present Southern Ocean. They evolved in conditions where food was abundant and water temperatures remained far warmer than those surrounding Antarctica now. Large size carried advantages in such environments. Bigger bodies could travel farther, dive effectively, and exploit productive feeding grounds stretching along continental margins. For millions of years, these giant penguins flourished in a world where forests still occupied portions of the continent and winter conditions remained comparatively moderate. The transformation of Antarctica altered that balance. As ocean circulation changed and colder waters expanded around the continent, marine food webs reorganized. Species that had once dominated certain ecological roles declined or shifted their ranges. Hunting strategies that worked in warmer seas became less efficient. Every generation faced environmental conditions slightly different from those experienced by its ancestors. Seymour Island preserves this transition with unusual clarity. Layer by layer, The fossil record documents the disappearance of the largest penguin species and the rise of smaller forms. The change did not occur all at once. It unfolded across immense spans of time, with populations adapting to increasingly cold waters and evolving bodies better suited to the new reality surrounding them. Body size influences heat exchange in complex ways. Larger animals generally retain warmth more effectively because their volume increases faster than their surface area. Yet maintaining a very large, warm-blooded body requires substantial energy, especially in frigid marine environments where heat constantly escapes into the surrounding water. At a certain point, the energetic costs become greater than the benefits. Evolution tends to favor forms that balance both demands successfully. The descendants that emerged from this process became more compact and efficient. Their proportions reduced unnecessary heat loss while preserving powerful diving abilities. Dense bones helped them descend through cold water in pursuit of prey, adapted to the growing Antarctic marine ecosystem. Selection refined these traits, generation after generation, until a new kind of penguin came to dominate the region. The modern emperor penguin represents the outcome of that long evolutionary filtering. Reaching roughly 1.2 meters in height and around 40 kilograms in mass, it remains the largest living penguin. Its physiology is among the most specialized found in any bird. Males incubate eggs through the Antarctic winter, enduring conditions that can fall below 40 degrees Celsius below zero or 40 degrees Fahrenheit below zero, while powerful winds sweep across the ice. Groups gather into shifting formations that distribute warmth throughout the colony, allowing individuals to exchange positions over time. The giants of the Eocene disappeared, yet their lineage persisted. Antarctica did not merely reshape the penguins that survived, it transformed them into something uniquely suited to the frozen world that followed. Few places in Antarctica allow the past to sit openly beneath the sky. Across most of the continent, ice conceals nearly everything, covering mountains, valleys, and bedrock beneath a frozen cover kilometers thick. Seymour Island is different. Located near the northeastern edge of the Antarctic Peninsula, it remains one of the rare places where rock reaches the surface, exposing pages of a story that vanished elsewhere long ago. Its importance comes from a geological sequence known as the La Meseta Formation. Stretching through much of the island, these sedimentary layers preserve an unusually detailed record of environmental change across the Eocene epoch and into the cooling world that followed. Each layer represents sediments deposited along ancient coastlines, estuaries, and shallow marine environments. Together they form a chronological archive spanning millions of years, capturing life during one of the most consequential transformations in Antarctic history. The oldest layers reveal an ecosystem that would seem almost unfamiliar beside modern Antarctica. Fossils from these rocks include sharks, rays, and numerous bony fish associated with temperate marine conditions. Early whales moved through coastal waters. On land, marsupials, closely related to species from South America, occupied connected habitats across the southern continents. Along shorelines, giant penguins stood among rich marine communities supported by productive seas. Moving upward through the formation is like advancing through time. Species that flourished during warmer conditions become less common. Certain marine groups disappear entirely. Ecological patterns begin to reorganize. Fossil assemblages record a world experiencing environmental stress as ocean temperatures declined and geographic connections shifted. The changes are visible not through a single dramatic event, but through a steady alteration in which organisms remained present and which faded from the record. One feature makes Seymour Island especially valuable to scientists. The transition associated with the boundary between the Eocene and Oligocene epochs appears within a comparatively narrow interval of rock. Around 33.9 million years ago, the fossil record changes noticeably. Diversity among sharks decreases, warm water species become scarce, marsupial mammals vanish from the sequence. Evidence points toward the final separation between Antarctica and South America, a tectonic change that transformed ocean circulation around the continent. Above this boundary, a different biological community emerges. Fossils increasingly belong to organisms adapted to colder conditions. Early representatives of the nototheniod lineage appear within Antarctic waters. Penguin communities begin to resemble forms better suited to life in a cooling environment. The foundations of the marine ecosystem that would characterize Antarctica for the next 34 million years become visible layer by layer. What makes Seymour Island extraordinary is not merely the fossils themselves. The island preserves transition. It captures the moment when one world yielded to another. A shark tooth, a penguin bone, a fragment of marsupial jaw, each occupies a precise position within the sequence, allowing scientists to reconstruct ecological change with unusual clarity. The rocks do not provide isolated snapshots. They preserve continuity. The island remains largely ice-free today because local geological and climatic conditions discourage permanent accumulation. In a sense, that exposure is a final remnant of the ancient connection between Antarctica and South America, a surviving trace of geography that once shaped an entire continent's destiny. Standing before those layered rocks, the passage from greenhouse world to frozen continent ceases to be an abstraction. It becomes a sequence that can be followed horizon by horizon, preserving the transformation of Antarctica within the stone itself. Among all the archives Earth has left behind, Antarctica preserves evidence with a fidelity that feels almost improbable. Many fossil localities offer scattered traces, fragments carried apart by erosion, compression, and time. A single bone may survive while the landscape that surrounded it disappears. A leaf impression may remain while the forest itself is erased. Antarctica presents a different kind of record, one assembled across immense spans of time and protected by conditions that favored preservation instead of destruction. Within sediments recovered from the continental margin, researchers found fossil forest soils still threaded with root networks that remained where they grew. Amber preserved remnants of insects that once moved through polar woodlands during an era when darkness alternated with warmth instead of ice. Deep within the continent, cylinders of frozen water contained samples of ancient air preserved in sequence. Far below the ice sheet, liquid lakes endured in isolation for intervals measured in millions of years. Each discovery emerged from a different setting, yet all belonged to the same continent and the same long story. The structure of that story matters as much as the evidence itself. Ice accumulates layer upon layer, snowfall compressed into a stratified archive extending downward through time. Unlike many geological records, where sections may be folded, eroded, or interrupted, large portions of the Antarctic ice sheet preserve an orderly chronology. The deeper a sample is extracted, the further back the record extends. Seasonal snowfall becomes annual layers become millennia, and millennia become a sequence that can be followed with remarkable precision. When scientists drilled through the ice at locations in East Antarctica, they recovered air trapped within microscopic bubbles. Those bubbles contained atmosphere from periods stretching back hundreds of thousands of years. Measurements of carbon dioxide, methane, volcanic particles, and other components did not depend entirely on indirect reconstruction. Researchers were examining samples of air that once circulated above oceans, forests, deserts, and grasslands before becoming sealed within accumulating ice. The atmosphere itself had become part of the archive. Other records reach further. Sediment cores, extracted from the seafloor surrounding Antarctica, preserve pollen grains, chemical signatures, microscopic organisms, and mineral deposits that document environmental conditions extending tens of millions of years into the past. Together, they bridge intervals far older than the oldest ice. Through these sediments, scientists reconstructed coastlines, vegetation, ocean temperatures, and ecosystems from worlds that existed long before the formation of the modern ice sheet. A striking thread runs through many of these discoveries. Conditions that transformed Antarctica also protected evidence of its earlier forms. Cooling oceans reduced biological activity on parts of the seafloor, helping preserve sediments that contained traces of vanished forests. Expanding ice shielded atmospheric records from alteration. Isolation safeguarded materials that might have disappeared elsewhere. Processes that reshaped the continent became, in an indirect way, guardians of memory. Seen together, the fossil soils, amber, sediment cores, atmospheric samples, and subglacial environments form something larger than individual discoveries. They create continuity across nearly 100 million years of planetary history. Warm greenhouse landscapes, cooling seas, growing ice sheets, and modern climate records all remain connected through evidence preserved in a single region of Earth. The remarkable lesson is that Antarctica did not merely experience transformation. It retained a layered account of that transformation, allowing events separated by tens of millions of years to be read within the same overarching narrative. The continent remembers with unusual clarity, and the record remains written across stone, sediment, water, and ice. A human life feels long from the inside. Childhood stretches across years that seem immense. Adulthood gathers decades into memory, and family stories often reach no further than a few generations. Our instincts were shaped around migrations, harvests, winters, and summers. Deep time exists far beyond the range of those instincts, occupying a scale so large that ordinary experience offers almost no comparison. Consider the history of our own species. Anatomically modern humans have existed for roughly 300,000 years. Every language ever spoken, every migration across continents, every tool, belief, and tradition emerged within that interval. By geological standards, it is a brief chapter. The Antarctic rainforest endured for approximately 90 million years. That means those forests persisted for around 300 times longer than our species has existed. The comparison grows stranger when measured against civilization. Agriculture, cities, writing, trade networks, kingdoms, republics, and industrial societies all belong to roughly the last 10,000 years. Everything commonly called recorded history fits within that narrow slice of time. The polar forests occupied Antarctica for about 9,000 times the entire duration of civilization. A continent covered in trees remained recognizably forested through spans of time so long that countless human histories could fit inside them without filling even a small fraction of their existence. Then came the transition that reshaped the continent. Geological evidence suggests the expansion of permanent Antarctic ice unfolded across roughly 100,000 years. To human perception, that sounds unimaginably long. Against the backdrop of 90 million years, it appears startlingly brief. A world that had persisted through immense stretches of planetary history yielded within an interval shorter than the total existence of our own species. The chronology becomes even more surprising near the end of the story. Fossil evidence indicates that Antarctic beech trees survived in parts of the continent until approximately 2 to 3 million years ago. Those trees belong to lineages whose ancestors had watched Antarctica drift, cool, and transform across ages. During that same period, members of the genus Homo were already present in Africa, shaping stone tools and navigating landscapes very different from the southern polar regions. The final traces of a once widespread Antarctic forest existed within reach of human ancestry. Many people imagine the Antarctic ice sheet as something timeless, as permanent as the oceans themselves. The numbers tell a different story. The modern ice sheet formed about 34 million years ago. That is an immense age from a human perspective, yet it occupies less than 1% of Earth's approximately 4.5 billion year history. For most of the planet's existence, Antarctica carried no continent-wide ice sheet at all. Viewed from this angle, permanence becomes difficult to define. Forests that lasted tens of millions of years vanished, coastlines shifted, oceans changed course. Entire ecosystems appeared, flourished, and disappeared. Even the ice sheet, which seems immovable today, belongs to a specific chapter rather than the whole book. Deep time does not diminish the present, it expands it. The farther the record extends into the past, the more clearly it reveals that change is not an interruption of Earth's story. Change is the story itself, unfolding across intervals far larger than the human mind was ever designed to hold. Imagine standing within a forest that has existed for longer than any creature can comprehend. Generations are born, live, and vanish. Species appear and disappear. Rivers alter course. Mountains weather grain by grain. Through all of it, the forest remains. To the organisms living among its roots and branches, permanence would seem self-evident. The trees were there before memory began, and they would appear destined to remain forever. That was the reality of Antarctica for tens of millions of years. Forests covered the continent through intervals so immense that the rise and fall of entire ecosystems unfolded beneath their canopy. Animals moved across land connections linking southern continents, following routes that no longer exist. The landscape changed in countless ways, yet the larger world around those forests retained a familiar character. Nothing within the experience of any living organism could have suggested that the continent was approaching a transformation that would eventually erase that environment almost completely. The same principle applied near the end of that long chapter. The final Antarctic beech trees persisted along coastal margins while conditions steadily cooled. Their lineage stretched back through ages of planetary change. From the perspective of a tree rooted in that soil, the advancing ice would not have appeared as the opening movement of a continent-wide transition. It would have been one season among many, one fluctuation within a world that had always endured. Later, the ice itself became the enduring feature. Once the continental ice sheet expanded across Antarctica, it developed characteristics that encouraged its own survival. Bright surfaces reflected sunlight. High elevations promoted colder conditions. Vast stores of frozen water reinforced the system. Across millions of years, the ice sheet came to seem as permanent as the forests that preceded it. Stability became the defining impression. Evidence gathered during recent decades reveals a more complicated reality. Large sections of Antarctic ice are losing mass each year. Floating ice shelves that persisted through thousands of years have fractured with surprising speed. Ocean water reaching vulnerable parts of the ice sheet carries enough heat to reshape regions once thought resistant to rapid change. These developments do not mean the entire continent is on the verge of disappearance. They do demonstrate that even the most imposing features of Earth operate within conditions that can shift. The lesson extends beyond Antarctica. Ocean circulation patterns, rainfall systems, growing seasons, and climatic boundaries all depend on interactions among atmosphere, water, land, and ice. Human societies developed during a particular arrangement of those interactions. Agriculture, cities, transportation networks, and population centers expanded within a climate framework that felt dependable because it remained relatively stable across recorded history. Geology offers a broader perspective. The fossil roots, preserved soils, amber, sediments, and ice archives examined throughout this story reveal that Earth has occupied very different states in the past. Warm polar forests once existed where glaciers now stand. Oceans rose and fell. Ecosystems reorganized. None of those changes violated physical laws. They emerged from the same planetary processes operating today. The permanence problem rests in the gap between experience and reality. Human beings naturally interpret familiar conditions as enduring because our lives are short compared with planetary history. Antarctica shows how deceptive that impression can be. A rainforest that lasted 90 million years disappeared. An ice sheet that seems eternal occupies only a chapter of Earth's story. Stability exists, but it is never the same thing as permanence. Consider a traveler arriving at Antarctica with no knowledge of its past. They would see a continent of ice, wind, rock, and sea. The landscape would appear stripped to essentials, reduced to white horizons and dark mountain ridges. It might seem natural to describe such a place as untouched, a surviving fragment of an older Earth preserved beyond the reach of change. Yet the deeper story points in another direction entirely. Antarctica is not a continent defined by preservation, it is defined by transformation. Few regions on Earth have experienced such profound reinvention. It began as part of a supercontinent positioned far from the pole. Forests spread across its surface, rivers crossed broad lowlands, dinosaurs moved through environments that shared more in common with temperate woodlands than with anything associated with Antarctica today. Later came rainforests, coastal ecosystems rich with life, and migration routes linking distant southern lands. Each chapter replaced the one before it. The frozen continent, visible, now represents the latest state in a sequence that spans more than 100 million years. Every previous version vanished. Forests gave way to cooling climates. Land connections disappeared beneath widening seas. Ice advanced across ground that had supported roots, animals, and flowing water. Layer upon layer of change accumulated until Antarctica reached a condition unlike any earlier stage in its history. The appearance of permanence emerged only after an immense series of transitions. Even in its present form, movement never ceases. Ice streams drift toward the coast year after year, carrying entire landscapes with them. Deep fractures open and lengthen through glaciers under mechanical strain. Great blocks detach from ice shelves and enter the ocean as icebergs, beginning journeys that can last years before they melt away. Motion unfolds on scales that often escape immediate perception, yet the continent remains in continual adjustment. Air contributes its own force to the process. Dense polar air forms across the elevated interior and descends toward lower coastal regions. These katabatic winds can reach speeds approaching 300 kilometers per hour in favored locations. They sculpt snow, expose rock, and reshape surface conditions through persistence alone. Antarctica does not rely on dramatic eruptions or earthquakes to display activity. Its energies often operate through repetition and duration. The continent also expands and contracts with the seasons. During warmer months, sea ice retreats from the coastline across millions of square kilometers of ocean. As winter returns, frozen water spreads outward again, enlarging Antarctica's effective footprint until it becomes roughly twice its continental size. No other geographic feature on Earth undergoes a seasonal shift of comparable scale. The boundary between ocean and ice redraws itself each year like a recurring pulse. Viewed across geological time, Antarctica resembles neither a museum nor a relic. It functions as a living record of planetary processes acting across immense intervals. Climate, evolution, ocean circulation, and tectonic change all leave traces there. Reading those traces demands patience measured in generations of research and millions of years of history. Far below the ice, earlier worlds remain present. Roots still occupy buried soils. Amber still preserves fragments of vanished ecosystems. Sediments still contain evidence of forests that flourished under months of polar sunlight. The continent carries these memories within itself, not as curiosities from a distant age, but as chapters of its own continuing identity. A paradox rests at the center of Antarctica's story, one that emerges only after following the continent through forests, oceans, ice sheets, and deep time. The same force that erased an entire world also became the guardian of countless others. The contradiction remains preserved across the continent, written into ice, water, stone, and living cells. The advancing ice consumed landscapes that had existed for tens of millions of years. Forest soils disappeared beneath accumulating layers of snow. Root systems that once anchored living trees were compressed under increasing weight. Amber, leaves, pollen, and traces of vanished ecosystems passed into darkness. Year after year, century after century, the expanding ice sheet spread across the continent until the familiar conditions of the older Antarctic world no longer remained. In every practical sense, the ice became a tomb. It buried environments that had flourished through ages, almost impossible to imagine. Yet burial did not always mean extinction. Far below the surface lies Lake Vostok, isolated beneath roughly 4 kilometers of ice. No sunlight reaches its waters. Pressures approach 350 times those experienced at sea level. The lake may have remained sealed from the outside world since the earliest stages of ice sheet formation. Conditions that appear hostile from a human perspective have nevertheless produced one of the most intriguing biological mysteries on Earth. Evidence suggests a functioning ecosystem may persist there, potentially containing thousands of species adapted to circumstances found nowhere else on the planet. Elsewhere around Antarctica, another story unfolded within the surrounding seas. The ancestors of modern notothenioid fish faced environmental changes severe enough to eliminate many marine organisms. Their response emerged through evolution, operating across millions of years. Antifreeze proteins developed within their bodies, preventing lethal ice crystal growth in tissues and blood. Those adaptations transformed an ordinary group of fish into the dominant inhabitants of the Southern Ocean. Today, they occupy ecological roles stretching from coastal habitats to deep marine environments. A biological innovation born from freezing conditions now attracts medical researchers seeking better methods for preserving organs intended for transplantation. The emperor penguin offers a different expression of the same pattern. The species does not retreat from the harshest season. Breeding occurs during the Antarctic winter itself. Adults endure darkness, powerful winds, and temperatures that can fall below 40 degrees Celsius below zero, or 40 degrees Fahrenheit below zero. Eggs are protected atop the feet of their parents, while entire colonies cooperate through dense rotating formations. Survival emerges through behaviors shaped specifically for conditions that would exclude most other birds. Even the climate record owes its existence to the persistence of ice, layer after layer, accumulated without being mixed or erased. Snowfall became a chronological archive. Tiny bubbles of ancient air remain trapped within frozen strata, preserving direct samples of atmospheres that vanished hundreds of thousands of years ago. Researchers reading those layers are examining pages that remained undisturbed from the moment they formed. Viewed together, these stories resist simple categories of destruction or preservation. The ice ended ecosystems, yet it also sheltered others. It erased landscapes while safeguarding their memory. Antarctica became more than the absence of the rainforest that once stood there. The continent evolved into a different kind of world, one where survival took unfamiliar forms and where life, history, and transformation became inseparable parts of the same frozen record. Imagine placing the entire span of human history beside the Antarctic ice sheet. Every city ever built, every language spoken, every kingdom, republic, and empire would occupy only the thinnest mark along its timeline. The ice sheet was already old when the earliest members of our genus appeared. It had already endured ages of planetary change before the first stone tools were shaped by human hands. For 34 million years, the ice remained. During that interval, species emerged, flourished, and disappeared. Giant penguins once patrolled southern coastlines and then vanished from the world. Sharks that hunted through warmer Antarctic seas passed into extinction. Marsupials that moved across southern land connections disappeared from the continent's story. The final beach forests withdrew from the coast and were lost. Through all those transformations, the ice sheet persisted. Its longevity becomes even more striking when measured against our own lineage. The entire evolutionary history of the genus Homo occupies only the closing fraction of the ice sheet's existence. Human beings often think in terms of generations, centuries, or perhaps a few thousand years. 34 million years stretches beyond ordinary intuition. It encompasses intervals so immense that mountain ranges, ocean basins, and ecosystems themselves become participants in the narrative. During that span, the Atlantic Ocean continued widening. Tectonic plates shifted their positions. Countless organisms adapted to changing climates and environments. The Antarctic ice sheet experienced repeated oscillations between colder and warmer conditions. Ice ages arrived and retreated. Interglacial periods followed. Across 8 complete glacial cycles, recorded within the recent geological archive, the ice sheet endured. It expanded, contracted, and adjusted, yet it remained a defining feature of the southern pole. This endurance can create the impression that the ice sheet is permanent. Geological records suggest something different. Its persistence depends on physical conditions. Ocean circulation, atmospheric chemistry, planetary reflectivity, and global temperature all contribute to maintaining its stability. The system functions because many interconnected components remain within particular ranges. When those conditions change, the ice responds. Today, that response is measurable. Antarctica is losing approximately 150 billion tons of ice each year. Observations show that the rate of loss has increased in recent decades. Warm ocean water reaches vulnerable portions of the ice from below, floating shelves thin, glaciers accelerate toward the sea. Areas that once reflected sunlight become darker expanses of open water capable of absorbing additional heat. These processes are not isolated events. They are connected parts of a larger climatic system. Understanding what the ice sheet does helps explain why its future matters. Antarctica influences deep ocean circulation, helping drive the movement of water, heat, oxygen, and nutrients throughout the global ocean. It contributes to patterns of rainfall that shape ecosystems and agriculture far from the polar regions. Its bright surface reflects substantial amounts of incoming solar energy back into space, moderating planetary temperatures. The ice sheet therefore functions as more than a frozen accumulation of snow. It participates in the machinery of Earth itself. Its presence helps define the environmental framework within which modern ecosystems developed and human civilization emerged. Seen from this perspective, Antarctica carries a significance that extends far beyond its shoreline. Its history reveals how profoundly one continent can influence the trajectory of an entire planet, and how deeply the present world remains connected to processes that began tens of millions of years ago. Place two clocks side by side. One measures the movement of continents, the rise of mountain ranges, and the transformation of climates across millions of years. The other measures generations, harvests, governments, and human lives. Antarctica exists at the intersection of both, and much of its story comes from trying to understand how those vastly different clocks can describe the same events. The rainforest that once covered parts of Antarctica endured for roughly 90 million years. Its disappearance unfolded over approximately 100,000 years, a duration that seems immense from a human perspective, yet appears brief in geological terms. The great ice sheet that replaced it may have required a similar span of time to establish itself. Once formed, it persisted through 34 million years of planetary change. Along the margins of that transition, the last Antarctic beech trees endured for millions upon millions of years before finally vanishing between 2 and 3 million years ago. Viewed through geological time, entire worlds can disappear within intervals that specialists describe as rapid. The asteroid impact that ended the Cretaceous Paleogene extinction event occurred in a single day. Ecological recovery and reorganization continued for millions of years afterward. The separation that opened the Drake Passage unfolded gradually across tectonic timescales, yet the climatic transformation that followed appears abrupt in sedimentary records. Earth often works through a combination of long preparation and comparatively swift consequence. Human history occupies a very different scale. Civilization spans roughly 10,000 years. The Industrial Revolution began approximately 250 years ago. Most of the acceleration in Antarctic ice loss has been documented during the last 45 years. These intervals are long enough to shape societies, economies, and cultures, yet they barely register within many geological archives. A sediment core extracted from the seafloor condenses thousands of years into thin layers. An ice core compresses centuries into bands measured in centimeters. Future researchers examining such records millions of years from now would likely see the entirety of human industrial activity represented as a narrow chemical horizon. Atmospheric changes, altered carbon dioxide concentrations, and shifts in biological communities might appear as a distinct line separating one state of the Earth system from another. Geology teaches that thin lines deserve attention. The boundary marking the asteroid impact appears as a remarkably narrow layer enriched with unusual elements. The transition between Eocene warmth and Oligocene cooling occupies a relatively restricted portion of the rock record. Major planetary reorganizations often leave signatures far smaller than the magnitude of their consequences would suggest. This perspective creates an unusual tension. Human beings experience current changes as unfolding across decades. Geological archives may eventually record the same developments as a single moment. Both interpretations are correct within their respective scales. The apparent contradiction arises because the clocks are measuring different things. Evidence from Antarctic ice cores adds another dimension to this comparison. Across 800,000 years of preserved atmospheric history, carbon dioxide concentrations and temperature changed repeatedly. Ice ages came and went. Warm intervals returned. Yet, the pace of change, documented during the last century, stands apart from anything preserved in that record. The direction of change has precedence in Earth's past. The speed does not. Antarctica, therefore, offers more than a history of forests, ice, and oceans. It reveals how the same event can appear gradual and instantaneous at once, depending on the timescale through which it is viewed. Within that overlap of the slow and the fast, the continent continues to record the passage of both clocks. Far from the coastline, beyond the reach of sunlight and weather, there exists a layer of Earth that once knew a very different sky. Deep beneath the East Antarctic ice sheet, compressed under roughly 4 kilometers of ice, and separated from the present by 34 million years, traces of a rainforest remain where they were left. The ground that nourished roots still exists. The sediments that gathered around fallen leaves still exist. Time has passed over them without erasing them. That buried landscape belonged to a continent unlike the one shown on modern maps. Forest soils supported ecosystems whose histories stretched across immense spans of time. Resin hardened around insects and became amber while branches still stood overhead. Pollen drifted from conifers, and ferns adapted to months of darkness, sustained by a climate warm enough to support growth at polar latitudes. Those particles settled, were covered, and endured. The cold that later transformed the continent also preserved much of the evidence, holding fragments of that vanished environment in extraordinary detail. The ice resting above those remains is itself an artifact of deep history. It has endured for 34 million years. The forest below traces its roots through nearly 90 million years of continuity. Between those numbers lies a span of 56 million years, an interval exceeding the entire evolutionary history of primates. Such arithmetic stretches beyond ordinary intuition. It compresses familiar measures of time until they seem almost weightless against the backdrop of planetary change. Water leaving the margins of Antarctica today eventually enters the same Southern Ocean that has shaped this story from beginning to end. Marine reptiles once traveled through those waters. Later, changing currents altered the distribution of heat across the globe and transformed the fate of an entire continent. The temperature of that ocean continues to influence the stability of the ice sheet resting above the buried roots. Past and present remain connected through circulation, chemistry, and motion, each linked to processes operating across scales far larger than any individual lifetime. Earth itself does not fit easily into ideas of fragility. Its history reveals immense resilience and immense power. The planet can sustain rainforests near the pole and later cover them with kilometers of ice. It can maintain liquid water in darkness beneath crushing pressure. It can shape fish whose blood resists freezing and support ecosystems adapted to conditions once thought impossible. Through every transformation, physical laws continue their work without pause. Neither permanence nor intention guides these changes. Continents drift, ocean gateways open and close, atmospheric chemistry shifts, ice advances, retreats, and reorganizes landscapes. Living things flourish within one set of conditions and adapt, migrate, or disappear when those conditions change. Antarctica's rainforest did not vanish through design. A sequence of interconnected processes unfolded, and over geological time, a world that had persisted for tens of millions of years gave way to another. The roots remain locked within stone, amber remains within sediment. Above them stands a continent of ice, carried through the ages on a rotating planet. The same forces that shaped forests, currents, glaciers, and oceans continue their work today, steady in their operation, immense in their reach, and written across Antarctica in layers that still endure.